The cemetery under the mall. I work as a maintenance technician at a mall here in Florida, and honestly, I was never the type who believes in ghost stories or anything like that. But what happened to me that day changed my way of seeing things. The mall has always had a strange reputation. The colleagues complained that the electrical system was still giving problems, even with relatively new equipment. What was worse, the reforms never lasted. Walls cracked out of nowhere, pipes leaked where there should not be water. It always seemed more incompetence of the construction company than something supernatural. Only that on that particular afternoon, I was called in to resolve a short circuit underground, and that's when things started getting really skid. When I went down to the basement, I already felt a change in the air. I can't explain very well, but it seemed colder down there than it should be. This was strange because, as a rule, the underground ventilation system was always turned off to save energy. As I walked through the tight corridors between the pipes, my flashlight started to fail even with the battery full. And that's when I noticed something bizarre, a smell. It was a heavy, moist odor, which did not look like something rotting, but sticking in the nostrils. I have been through many casual situations in this work, but this was different. At the end of the corridor, I saw something glimmering with the weak light of the flashlight. I thought some equipment was forgotten, but when I approached, I realized that it was nothing like that. It was a tombstone. The tombstone seemed completely out of place there. It was gray, worn stone with moss in some parts. It had a name, data, and an epitaph, but the words were so corroded that it was impossible to read them properly. What made me more confused is that it was stuck directly in the concrete floor, as if it had been left there on purpose. I thought maybe it was part of some historical material, a trinket that someone had forgotten. But as I looked at it, I noticed that there were others around. I started to run the lantern through the floor and saw 3 more tombstones, all partially covered by dust and debris. My heart started racing, but I tried to convince myself that it should be some kind of old warehouse before they built the mall. As I tried to understand what I was selling, the sound of footsteps began to echo in the corridor. At first, I thought it was some of the other technicians, but the strange thing was that the steps did not follow a human rhythm. It was an irregular sound, dragged, as if someone was limping or dragging something heavy. I yelled, "Who's there?" and I came with the flashlight, but I saw nothing. At this point, the flashlight was swinging even more, blinking as if it were to go out for good. It was then that I noticed another detail that made me shiver to the bones: the smell. It grew stronger every second, as if it was coming closer with the steps. Do not wait to find out where it came from. I decided that I had seen enough and started to go back down the corridor in the direction of the exit. As I walked quickly to get out of the underground, I felt something that almost made me drop the lantern on the ground. It was as if the air around me became heavier, denser, to the point of being difficult to breathe. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound behind me, something that seemed like a mixture of low moaning and a dry style like wood breaking. I didn't have the courage to look back. I just kept walking, trying to ignore the growing cold that seemed to be coming up my spine. But when I got close to the ladder, the flashlight went out. I was in absolute darkness. You know that kind of pitch where you can't even see your own hand? That was it. I tried to keep calm, but my heart seemed to be beating in my neck. And that's when I heard the sound of something falling to the ground, like a stone or metal, right near where I was. Lights the flashlight of the phone, tremendous, and I looked back, but I saw nothing. At least not immediately. The dim light reached one of the tombstones, and revealed something that left me paralyzed. It looked like a mark, like a dark hand, imprinted on the stone. It was not paint, more like an extinction as soot or earth. I knew it wasn't there before because I had looked directly at that tombstone minutes ago. It was at this moment that something inside me is specific that I need to get out of there. Went up the stairs running, with the phone in hand. When we got to the top floor, where the technical corridors are, everything seemed normal. The noise of the shops, people walking, it was as if nothing had happened. But I knew something was wrong down there. I tried to act like nothing happened, but honestly it was hard. My uniform was soaked in sweat, and I trembled so much that I had to lean on the wall to get myself together. I thought about calling someone, but what would I say? I found tombstones in the basement and hear strange noises. Probably I will laugh in my face, or worse, send me back there to take pictures and check. I decided it was better not to say anything at that moment. Only while trying to laugh, I realized the smell kept on me. That moist, almost like wet earth smell seemed to have stuck in my clothes. It was impossible to ignore. I took my radio to warn that the short in the basement would need more research, but as soon as I pressed the button to speak, the radio began to emit a deafening hiss, as if something interfered with the signal. Hung up at the time and threw in the trolley. I managed to get out of the technical hall and mixed with the movement of the mall, trying to distract me. Walking among people and hearing the buzz seemed to bring me a little normality. I even went into a convenience store to buy a bottle of water and take a deep breath. But when I was in the box, something bizarre happened. The ambient music, which was a playlist before, suddenly cut out, and a metallic sound, almost like whispered voices, began to come out of the speakers. Everyone on the site stopped, confused, but what really freaked me out was what I heard clearly in the middle of one thing: my name. It was not something that could be confused. It was my full name, spoken in a drawn-out way, as if someone had recorded and distorted. Don't wait to hear more. I left a bottle on the counter and ran out of there. I ran to the maintenance room and locked the door behind me, trying to catch my breath. He can no longer ignore. Something very wrong was happening. I took the radio from the tool trolley and tried to turn it on again, but it still squeaked as before, only this time there was something else. It was as if a low, almost imperceptible sound accompanied the squeal. Turned on my phone and tried to record, but as soon as I pressed the record button, the radio stopped working completely. I was sitting in the chair, looking at the device, when I felt that change again in the air. I can't explain, but it seemed like the whole room got heavier, more oppressive. Suddenly, I heard 3 loud banging on the door. It was not common to have someone knock there, since the technicians used the intercom or radios to communicate. My first occurrence was freezing. Slowly I stood up and asked, "Who is it?" No answer, only the muffled sound of the mall in the background. The beats came again, this time stronger. I took the key and unlocked the door, but when I opened it, there was no one there. I looked sideways in the empty corridor, which only gave access to the technical room and the service elevator. I was sure that no one could run away so fast without me hearing footsteps. I closed the door with more force than necessary and leaned against it, trying to process what was happening. I wanted to get out of there, get my things and go home, but at the same time I was afraid to walk alone through the mall again. I decided that I would stay there until the shift ended and that, the next day, I would ask someone to check the basement in my place. The rest of the shift was dragged through. I stood in the room, trying not to think about what had happened, but it was impossible. Every little noise seems amplified. The air ducts making noise, the distant sound of people in the mall. Everything seemed out of place. When it was finally time to go, he left quickly, without looking back. On the way to the parking lot, I started feeling a little better. The natural light of the late afternoon helped to ward off that heavy feeling. But as I walked to the car, I passed a service entrance that led to the basement. It was then that I smelled again. Not as strong as before, but unmistakable. I stopped for a second, wondering if I should ignore or check. But before I could decide, I heard a sound that made my blood cold, a low groan coming from inside. I ran to the car without thinking twice. I turned on the engine and left the parking lot as fast as I could. All the way home, I was looking in the rear view mirror with the feeling that something or someone could be following me. Arriving home, I threw my things on the couch and went straight to the shower. I tried to forget everything, convincing myself that I was exaggerating, that my head was playing tricks because of fatigue. But when I went to sleep, I realized that it was not over. About 3 a.m., I woke up with a noise coming from the room. It was as if something had fallen to the ground. I went to check, terribly scared, but there was nothing out of place. The only strange detail was that my uniform, which I had left on the couch, was on the floor and looked wet, as if it had been soaked in dirty water. After that night, my head did not stop spinning. I could barely sleep after the incident with the uniform, and the feeling that something was wrong seemed to follow me. The next day, I considered making up an excuse not to go to work, but I knew I couldn't just avoid shopping forever. Also, I first understood what happened. When I got to the shift, I tried at all costs to avoid any talk about the basement. But then I noticed something that made me even more uncomfortable. A group of maintenance workers were gathered near the central radio, commenting on how the freight elevators had worked in the early hours. One of them, Paul, reports that he had gone down to check and that the smell downstairs was unbearable. He laughed, but I saw in his expression that it was not a joke. I think it was this comment that made me take courage and ask the supervisor if there was any record of the basement before they built the mall. He looked at me with strangeness, as if my question was completely questionable, but replied that he knew nothing specific. Just said the place was an old abandoned shopping area before it was demolished for the mall. I don't really believe that. Picked up my cell phone during the break and started searching for information. After a while, I found an old article about the history of the area. And that's where it all came together. Decades ago, the land was used as a cemetery for immigrant workers. What made me shiver was reading that, for financial reasons, many bodies were not exhumed when we planned to build the mall above. They simply cemented the site and got the work. Reading that was like getting a punch in the stomach. The place where I had smelled that, seen those tombstones, was literally a covered cemetery. Suddenly, everything started to make sense. The structural failures, the electrical problems, and especially what happened to me underground. I wanted to tell someone, but who would believe? Also, if the mall reported that I was talking about it, I would probably lose my job. I kept the information to myself, but at the same time felt like I needed some way to protect myself. I remembered my grandmother, who was always very religious, saying that sometimes things do not want to hurt us, just want to be remembered. So that night after work, I stopped at a flower shop and bought a small bouquet. Didn't know what to do, but I had to try something. The next day, I arrived early before the mall opened and went underground. It was calmer this time, although the smell was still there, lighter but present. I walked to the tombstones that I had seen before and left the bouquet there on the ground, right in the center. I stood still for a moment, not knowing what to say or do, then murmured something like, "I'm sorry. Don't know what happened here, but I hope it helps." I felt kind of stupid talking to myself, but at the same time, something changed. The air seemed less heavy, almost as if the tension had subsided. I went back to the maintenance room with the strange feeling that maybe I had done the right thing. But what happened next still gives me shivers just to remember. After leaving the flowers underground, the routine at work seemed to be back to normal. I no longer heard any strange noises or had problems with equipment while I was down there. For a moment, I thought it was over and my gesture had worked somehow. But that only lasted 2 days. On the third night, while I was organizing some tools in the maintenance room, I heard the sound of something falling down the technical corridor again. It was the same as the first time. This time, however, I did not feel so much fear. Took my flashlight and went there, trying to convince myself that it was just some misplaced equipment. When I got to the place, I saw a small piece of metal on the ground, as if it had been thrown on purpose. And as I went down to get it, I felt that presence again. The air was cold, and a shiver came up through my spine. Before I could get up, I heard a voice clearly. It was low, almost a whisper, but it seemed to come from all sides. "Thank you." That's what I heard. Simple, straight, but scary enough for me to drop the piece and run back to the room. Closed the door and stood there, trying to understand what had just happened. It was not the same kind of fear I felt before, when it seemed like something wanted to hurt me. It was more like something was trying to communicate, almost like a goodbye. After that night, I never had any problems underground. The equipment stopped failing, and even coworkers noticed that the place seemed more stable. I have never told anyone what I did or heard, but even today, every time I walk by that entrance, I feel a chill, as if something was still there watching. Shadows of the forgotten graveyard. I live in a quiet atmosphere in Pennsylvania, which looks like an exit from a television commercial, with children playing in the backyards, dogs running loose, and families having barbecue on the weekend. The house where I live is facing a community park with all machines. The area is new. It was built less than 10 years ago, and everything still seems to shine from such good care. Only that, in the last few weeks, a strange thing began to happen. One night, when I was closing the curtains of the room, I saw something that left me puzzled. There was a shadow on the side of the neighbor's house, as if it were a cross. I thought it was strange because there was nothing in the park or in the yard that could design something like this. Did not give much importance. Imagine it was some reflection of light or something. Only that, in the following days, I began to notice that it was not just at the neighbor's house. Other houses near the park also had these strange shadows, always at night, always in the same place. What made everything more bizarre was that no matter the angle of light coming from the poles or windows, the obvious shadows always fixed, as if they were stuck in the wall. I told my wife, but she said it was bullshit, probably my imagination. Only it wasn't just me. Other neighbors also came to comment, first in the neighborhood group, then in conversations on the street. People were curious, but nobody seemed really scared. I, on the other hand, can't stop thinking about it. Something about those shadows made me uncomfortable, as if there was something wrong that no one wanted to admit. After days of trying to ignore it, I started paying more attention to the shadows. One night, as I was going out to take the trash, I saw that one of the houses across the street had a bigger shadow than before. It was not just a cross, but something that looked like a set of tombstones. The detail that made me shiver was to realize that the shadow was extremely detailed, with irregular edges, as if they were really carved stones. Only that there was absolutely nothing in the yard or on the street that could justify it. Took my phone and took a picture, but for some reason the image was blurred. It was as if something had been damaged. At the time, I thought there was a fault in the device, but now I think it was just that. I started to obsess, checking the shadows every night, trying to understand where they came from. One day, while talking to John, my neighbor on the corner, he reported that he had called an electrician because he lost the light poles that were defective. He had also repaired the shadows, but believed they were caused by some anomaly in the sound steam lamps. I decided to investigate on my own and went to the community park at night. The place was empty, lit only by the poles and lights of the houses around. I walked across the lawn, trying to find any object or structure that could explain the shadows, but there was nothing. When I passed near the swing area, I felt a strange cold, of the kind that makes you shudder even with coat. I looked around and for a moment, I swear I saw something moving in the darkness, like a shadow that shouldn't be there. After that night in the park, things started to get worse. The shadows were no longer just in the houses near the park. Now they appeared in random places, such as on fences, walls, and even sidewalks. Always the same way, as they were designed from a place that simply did not exist. Once, when I went out to check the yard, I saw something that made me want to run in. There was a big shadow on the side of my own house. It was different from the others, more defined, as if it were an obelisk or a huge cross. I can't explain, but I had a horrible feeling, as if it was watching me. I went in and traveled through all the doors. My wife started noticing my paranoia, and I told her to put it aside, but I knew it wasn't in my head. 1 or 2 days later, the mood in the environment began to change. The neighbors were more reserved. No one else commented on the shadows. It was as if everyone were pretending nothing was happening. But the worst happened on Friday night. I was in the room, trying to watch TV, when I heard a strange sound coming from outside. It looked like a strong wind, but when I looked out the window, the trees did not get in trouble. I took my flashlight and opened the door to see what was. When I lit the street, there was nothing. But looking to the side, I noticed that the shadows of the tombstones were again on the wall of my neighbor's house. Only this time they were not immobile. I swear I saw one of the shadows move, as if it was slowly sliding down the wall, changing shape. I went back inside immediately, locking the door so fast that I let the lantern fall to the ground. My heart was racing, and I could hardly think straight. I felt on the couch trying to understand what I had just seen. How could a shadow move the way it was? I stood there for a few minutes, but curiosity ended up beating me. Went up the stairs to the bedroom and looked out the window, which had a wide view of the street. It was then that I saw something even worse. It was not only the neighbor's house. Other houses also had shadows on the walls, but now all the reflections more intense, as if they were more alive. Some even protruded from the ground, stretching as if they wanted to reach something. I could not take my eyes off it, even with the fear of paralyzing me. That's when I realized something was wrong in the park. The lights of the poles were flashing, and there seemed to be a kind of low fog covering the lawn. There in the middle, between the swings and the slide, I saw something that I will never forget. It was like a tall silhouette, slender but completely dark, almost absorbing some of the light that was still there. She was still, but I was sure that she was looking at me. It was as if that being, or whatever it was waiting for something. Closed the curtain immediately, feeling a cold pass through my body, and I rushed down the stairs. My only wish was to get the car and leave, but my wife had already gone to sleep, and I did not want to leave her alone at home. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, with all the lights on, trying to ignore the sounds outside. When the day dawned, everything seemed to be back to normal. Went out to the yard, still with heavy head after hardly sleeping, and realized that the shadows had disappeared. It was as if nothing had happened. The neighbors were connected to the routine, cutting the grass, passing with the dogs. But something was different. The park seemed empty, quieter than usual. That day, I decided to work from home to avoid spending too much time away, but still, the discomfort did not abandon me. Later, while checking my email, I received a message in the neighborhood group. One of the neighbors did some research on the site and found something disturbing. The park and surrounding houses were built on top of an old municipal cemetery. It was a place where they buried indigent and people without family at the beginning of the last century. Obviously, no one took the trouble to exhume the bodies before construction. This information made my stomach turn. I tried not to think about it, but at night the restlessness came back. When I went out to throw the trash, I felt that strange cold again. There were no shadows in the houses this time, but the park seemed darker than normal, even with the lights on. I decided to walk to the entrance to see if I noticed anything. With each step, my chest became tighter, as if something wanted me to come back. When I got close to the fence, I heard a low sound like a murmur. It was almost inaudible, but you could see that they were voices, many of them overlapping, as if he was whispering all at the same time. I have frozen, had no courage to look directly at the park, but by the corner of my eye I saw the shadows began to form on the ground again, darker, more defined. I knew I had to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were stuck on the ground. The murmurs began to increase, and I could swear they were coming closer. It was then that one of the shadows, very close to me, began to take shape. It looked like an arm, or something similar, stretching out from the ground. The worst was the texture. It was not just a solid shadow, but seemed made of thick and dark smoke, almost tangible. The feeling of being watched became so strong that I finally managed to move. Threw the trash on the floor and ran home, locking the door behind me. My chest hurt so much that my heart beat, and I could barely breathe. I went upstairs to check on my wife, just to make sure she was okay. She slept peacefully, as if nothing had happened, while I felt that I was losing my mind. That night, I was awake in the room again, waiting for something to happen. But curiously, nothing happened inside. Outside, however, the park looked darker, and I could still hear those whispers from afar, even with the windows closed. When it was dawn, I made a decision. It was time to go. I told my wife nothing, but an excuse about wanting to move to a different area. The strangest thing was that after we started planning our move, the shadows stopped. I don't know if it was a coincidence or if that thing knew I was leaving. Today, looking back, I wonder if that was some kind of warning or something else. But what still scares me is the thought that those shadows have not disappeared. They are just waiting, growing up, maybe for the next person who decides to ignore what is buried there. The playground beneath. I worked as a janitor in a public school in a small town in Kansas. That was in 2013, when I had just moved there, trying to start over after a complicated item. The school had been built a few years ago, and everything looked new, bright, well kept. The children loved the playground, which was right in the back, surrounded by a large grassy area. My routine was simple. Clean rooms, check if things were working, and from time to time, help with small repairs. It was a quiet job, and I enjoyed watching the children running and playing during the break. But one day, something strange started to happen. A group of boys came to the entrance of the school carrying something that, at first sight, looked like a piece of wood. But when I got closer, I saw that it was a bone. At first, I didn't think it was a big deal. I thought it might be from some animal, since the area around the school was still somewhat rural, with fields and abandoned farms. But something about that bone didn't feel right. He was long, almost the size of an forearm, and looked old, with a yellowish color and some strange marks, as if he had been scratched. I kept it in my closet in the nursery, thinking of asking the director what to do. Only that the next day another child appeared with more bones. This time they were smaller, like fingers or ribs. And it was not just a child. More and more students began to find these bones while playing in the playground, especially in areas closer to the fence that delimits the school grounds. That's when I started to feel a chill in my spine. As the days passed, the situation became more strange. The children seemed attracted by the idea of looking for bones, as if it were a macabre treasure hunt. I saw this as a growing problem and decided to take the matter to the director. He laughed at the beginning, saying that it was probably some animal that had died long before the construction of the school. But when I showed him the bones that I kept, his face changed. He was silent for a few seconds, then asked me not to tell any of the parents or other employees. Said he would solve the situation discreetly. Something in the way he spoke made me suspicious, but I did not want to insist. Still, the discomfort only increased, mainly because the children continued to find more bones, now even near the slide and swings. That same week, while I was doing my night tour around the school, I decided to take a closer look at the playground. I took a lantern and went to the fence where the bones seemed to be appearing most often. As I walked through the grass, I noticed something strange on the ground, small depressions, as if the soil was seeding in some places. Some were so shallow that you could hardly notice, but others looked almost like holes. I used the flashlight to illuminate one of them and felt my stomach turn. Inside, you could see clearly more bones, but what really scared me was to realize that they were not just loose pieces. They were organized, as if someone had put them there on purpose. I knew I had to tell someone, but a part of me wanted to pretend that I hadn't seen anything. The next morning, I decided that I could not ignore it anymore. I went to the director again and insisted that he call someone, maybe a police officer or even an archaeologist, to investigate what was going on. He seemed upset, but finally arrived, saying that he would contact the city hall. For days, I have not heard anything about it, and meanwhile, the holes in the playground are obviously multiplied. The children began to stumble and hurt, which only made the situation worse. Until one afternoon I saw something that I will never forget. One of the younger boys, Ethan, was playing near the fence when he slipped into one of these holes and fell. I ran to help him, and when I got close, I saw what he had discovered. A part of the ground had completely given way, revealing what seemed to be a shallow grave. Inside, there were more bones than I could count. They weren't from animals. They were large, with clear joints, and even some teeth still stuck in a skull that was barely buried. Ethan started crying, and I picked him up, trying to keep calm as I pulled him away. Soon, other children approached, and before I could stop them, some of them had already seen the scene. everything turned into chaos. Parents were called in a hurry, and the director tried to cover up the situation, but it was impossible to hide that. On the same day, the police came and isolated the playground. The researchers were as shocked as I was, and one of them commented that it didn't seem to be a simple case. The earth gave way more as they moved, revealing more skeletons. And that's when they confirmed the school grounds had been a cemetery in the 19th century, forgotten when the city began to grow. After police confirmed that the site had been an old cemetery, the school entered into a climate of restrained panic. The parents were furious, demanding answers as to how a school was built on top of such a place without anyone knowing. Meanwhile, I couldn't get that image out of my head, the bones appearing under the ground, as if being pulled to the surface. The investigation progressed slowly, but some rumors came to circulate. A police officer commented to me half-corner that this cemetery was not only for ordinary burials. They said that many of the people buried there had died violently, accidents, diseases, and even some cases of crimes that were never solved. The idea that we were walking on it every day left me with a lump in my stomach. But the worst was yet to come. One night, while I was doing my usual rounds, I noticed something different. The lights of the playground were off, even if I was sure that I had been checked before. I went there to check. The silence was scary. Usually, even at night, you could hear the sounds of the road or the wind in the trees. But at that moment it seemed that the whole place was silent. As I approached the center of the playground, I felt the ground crumble slightly under my feet. My flashlight lit up an area of land that looked darker, almost black, as if something had been recently dug out. And that's when I heard it, a faint sound, almost like a moan, coming from the larger hole near the fence. I don't know how to describe it, but it seemed like a lament, as if several voices were mixed, low, dragged, but clearly human. I froze in place, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. But the sound became louder, clearer, and seemed to come from under the ground. My breathing was so uncontrolled that I had to lean on one of the poles in the playground to not fall. I wanted to run, but my legs just didn't respond. It was when something moved in the bigger hole. It was not big, but it looked like a hand, bony, with the earth still stuck to it, trying to emerge. That was enough for me to take the shock. I dropped my flashlight and ran back to the school building without looking back. I knew it wasn't safe to stay there for 1 second. After that night, I couldn't go back to the playground. I went to the director the next morning and told him, with the little calm that remained, what I had seen. He looked at me with a serious expression, but there was something else, as if he already knew that something like this could happen. Without giving me much explanation, he asked me to take the day off and assured me that he would report everything to the police. I did not trust him completely, but he was so shaken that he did not argue. However, when I returned the next day, the playground was surrounded by insulation tapes, and there were workers with heavy machinery digging the ground. I asked what was going on, and one of the engineers said he was removing the ground that had been compromised to reinforce the structure. But what made me suspicious was that he avoided me to look in the eyes. Later that day, I saw traffic leaving the area carrying large buckets of land. I went to one of the police officers who was still there and wanted what I had found. He hesitated before answering, but ended up saying that the place had many more bodies than they expected, some buried in poor conditions, almost thrown there. They were taking the remains for analysis and, according to him, would give a worthy end to the situation. However, What really scared me was what he said next. As if I didn't want to hear, the old residents said that this place was never quiet. There were always stories, things that nobody could explain. It kept pounding in my head. As much as they tried to solve it, I knew there was something besides the bones and the contaminated soil. After that day, the school decided to close the playground permanently. They said the area was unsafe and that repairs would take months. The children started playing in another makeshift place, but the atmosphere at school was never the same. I tried to follow my routine, but everything seemed different. At night, while doing my rounds, I always felt that weight in the air, as if something was still there watching me. It was impossible to avoid looking in the direction where the playground was, even if it was now just an empty lot surrounded by insulation tapes. One night, as I passed the corridor closest to the courtyard exit, I heard a sound. It was a low echo, something between a moan and a whisper. It seemed to come from outside. My heart sped, but something forced me to go to the door and look. When he opened the door, the school was completely quiet. The playground area looked even darker than normal, even with the light poles. And then I saw, in the middle of the ground, where before slipping, there was a figure. It was not solid. It seemed to be made of smoke, almost transparent, but its silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, slender, with long arms and a head that seemed to be leaning to the side as if it was watching me. I can't move. My feet were glued to the ground, and the cold I felt at that moment seemed to come from within, not from the environment. The figure did not move, but the sound of suggestions returned, this time more clear, coming from all successive. Don't know how, but I finally managed to turn around and run back inside, locking the door behind me. After that night, I knew I couldn't continue in that job. I resigned the next morning, making up an excuse about having to take care of personal matters. The director didn't seem surprised, which only reinforced my feeling that he knew much more than he said. While packing and preparing to leave the city, I tried to find some explanation for what I had seen. I researched more about the history of the area and found that, in addition to being an old cemetery of settlers, the place also had a meaning of cursed among the older residents. Stories of disappearances, unexplained sounds, and even visions of shadowy figures were told by those who lived decades ago, even before the school was built. It was as if that land had never been completely forgotten, even though the city tried to move on. The last night before I left, I decided to go through school one last time, by car, just to confirm myself that I was making the right decision. I stopped on the street, a good distance from the old playground, and observed the empty ground. There was nothing there, only the dark and the distant wind. But as I looked at the place, I felt that familiar feeling, a weight in the air, as if something was instructing me to leave. It was when I saw, for a fraction of a second, the same figure as before. She was there, in the same place, still impossible to ignore. Don't wait any longer. I started with the car and didn't look back. To this day, I don't know exactly what happened in that school or why those things started showing up. I just know I never came back. And honestly, I never intend to go back. The lake's secret. I grew up in a small town in Northern California, near a reservoir that was everyone's favorite hangout point during the summer. Everyone goes there, families making snacks, teenagers in kayaks and fishermen trying to catch a fish. During my childhood, I never thought much about the place, except for the fact that the water level rose and the dependence depending on the weather. In the summer of 2014, however, We had a drought so severe that the lake receded to levels no one in the city had ever seen. At first, it was just a curiosity. Everyone talked about the old foundations of houses that appeared, memories of the village that was flooded in the 1930s to create the reservoir. But a few weeks later, something much more strange was discovered: tombstones. Many of them. I was with two friends that afternoon. We decided to explore the newly revealed area because, after all, it wasn't every day that you could walk in places that were usually underwater. The floor was muddy and uneven, with pieces of concrete and old rusted fence scattered on all sides. After a while, we find tombstones. Some were bent, almost buried in the mud, while others were so intact that they could read the names and dates engraved on them. 1905, 1912, 1899. It seemed surreal to be walking in a cemetery that nobody knew existed. But what really made me shiver was to realize that many of these tombstones had no names, only mother, father, or initial. It was how these people were forgotten completely, even in death. The more we explore, the more it becomes strange. Some tombstones had carved marks that made no sense, like improvised symbols, almost like scribbles. One of them caught my attention because it was much deeper than the others, with only a visible part. We dug around a little with our hands to see if we could read the rest. It was when we realized that, next to her, there was something buried, but it wasn't another tombstone. It was a coffin, or what was left of one. The coffin was partially open, and even without moving much, I could see that there was still something inside. It was not a complete skeleton, but small fragments of bones that were partially dislocated over time. My bravest friend tried to look closer, but the smell of wet earth and something sour made him give up. The atmosphere began to get heavy. Not sure if it was the place itself or the things we found, but it seemed that it was different, denser, harder to breathe. When I looked at the lake, I noticed that the wind, which had previously made gentle waves on the surface of the water, had stopped. The whole place seemed aesthetic, as if everything had frozen in time. It was then that we heard a sound coming from one side. It was a low noise, something between a snap and a whisper, but enough to make us stop what we were doing and look around. We saw no one. It was impossible that there was another person there without our notice, since the area was completely open and the newly exposed land had no place to hide. But the sound continued, a little louder, coming from where the tombstones were more technical. We decided to go where the vineyard was. Maybe it was just the wind or some animal, trying to convince ourselves. Each step in the mud caused an annoying noise, a plock that echoed in silence. Getting close to the site, we saw something that made us stop immediately. A tombstone much larger than the others, almost intact, with inscriptions still legible. It was different because it had more details, like a face carved on top. Something in the eyes of that sculpture made me shiver. It seemed that he was looking directly at us. The inscription said only Restless Rest, 1889. Who would put something like this on a gravestone? And why? Before we could think about it, the strange sound got louder. It was no longer just a murmur or these. It seemed like water being stirred, even if the lake was still. That's when it happened. The ground started to vibrate slightly, as if something had moved under the mud. My friend, who was a little further ahead, specific. He pointed to the ground next to the large tombstone, where bubbles of mud began to form and burst, releasing an unbearable smell like sulfur. "I think it's some kind of gas stuck here," he said, trying to keep calm. But suddenly a larger bubble burst. and for a second something emerged from the mud. It was a hand, an old hand, bare but not like a dry bone. It was blackened, almost as if it had been preserved by the mud, but it was unlike anything I have ever seen. We three froze, and at that moment, the only thought in my head was, run. When we finally get to move, we run away as if our lives depended on it. The mud became difficult every step, and I had a constant feeling that something was right behind me, although I did not have the courage to look back. The smell of brimstone was still strong, almost burning my nostrils, and it seemed that the sound of the water was stirring us. When we look at a drier part, we stop for a moment to try to understand what had just happened. We were all panting, and one of my friends could barely speak. He pointed to the lake, and when I looked in the direction he was pointing, I felt my blood freeze. The surface of the water before the property was now full of small ripples, as if something was moving beneath it. Not knowing what to do, we decided to go back to the place where we had left the car, near the main entrance of the reservoir. The walk seemed endless, and the silence between us was almost as heavy as the fear we felt. On the way, we met an older fisherman who asked us if we had seen anything strange. We told, somewhat awkwardly, about the tombstones and what seemed to be a coffin. He frowned, looked at the lake, and said something I will never forget. This place has never been really quiet. People here know, but don't talk. You just saw the beginning. After that, he took his things and left, as if he had given us a warning. That moved me in a way I can't even explain. After what the fisherman said, we practically ran to the car. Nobody knew anything, but everyone was clearly shaken. As soon as we got in the car and started, that unbearable smell of mud and strange still be stuck on us, even with the windows open. We drove quietly until we reached my house, where I finally managed to breathe a little. We tried to talk about what we saw, but everything seemed so surreal that we spent more time staring at each other than we are actually talking. My friend, who had come closer to the major tombstone, seemed especially disturbed. He said that, while running, he had heard something behind him, like heavy steps in the mud, but every time he looked back, he saw nothing. After that night, none of us returned to the lake. A few days later, I heard rumors in the city that authorities had begun to investigate the tombstones and remains found, but no one seemed very interested in talking about it. Some local families commented that they already knew the lake had been built on an old village, but it was not just that. According to them, the place had a reputation of being cursed long before the reservoir existed. The strangest thing is that after the episode, we all started having similar dreams. Images of murky water, hands trying to pull us down, and the larger tombstone, with those carved eyes watching us. Don't know if it was our mind playing tricks or something deeper, but none of us managed to sleep properly for weeks. The dreams did not stop. Every night, it seemed to get more intense. They always started the same way. The water of the lake, immobile, reflecting a gray sky. Then the surface began to shake, and the shadows of the tombstone slowly emerged as if floating. And then the hands came, rising from the mud, always extending towards me. The most disturbing was that, in one of these dreams, I swear I heard a voice. It was not loud or clear, but seemed to call my name in a drawn way, almost as if someone was whispering underwater. When I woke up that night, I had the feeling that I could still hear the sound of my name echoing in my ears. A week later, I received an unexpected call from my friend who had seen the hand emerge from the mud. He seemed desperate and told me that something was wrong in his house. said he began to hear water dripping in places where there were no taps or incantations. At night, he woke up with a strong smell of mud, even if there was nothing in the room. He was so scared that he decided to move temporarily to his parents' house, but according to him, the noises and smell followed him there. After this conversation, I became even more restless. It seemed that something of that experience had been stuck to us. The idea that this could be more than just an order terrified me. I knew I had to do something, but I had no idea what. I decided that I could not ignore it anymore. The dreams, the smells, the children. It seemed like something was trying to reach us, chasing us. Again, I talked to my friend and convinced him to go with me to the city library to try to understand more about the history of the place. We spent hours going through old files, weather-gelled newspapers, and municipal reports. It was then that we found something that made us shiver. Before the village was flooded for the construction of the lake, there was a small chapel with an adjacent cemetery. However, the documents indicated that, due to lack of resources, the bodies were never completely removed before the land was flooded. Even worse, there were reports of residents at the time saying that the place was already known for strange activities, with disappearances and unexplained noises. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, lights on, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. But even with the TV on, I felt that presence. It wasn't just the smell or sounds. It was like something was watching me. I spent the next day afraid to go home, but did not know where to go. When I finally told my mother everything, she suggested that I do something symbolic, like a prayer or even an offering, to try and calm whatever it was. It seemed an absurd idea, but I was so desperate that I decided to try. The next day, I bought flowers and a small bag of coarse salt and went to the lake. I didn't want to go alone, but none of my friends had the courage to accompany me. Went to the place where we found the gravestone and left the flowers there. Meanwhile, I whispered an apology. Do not know if it was what I did or if it was a coincidence, but since that day, the smells and children stopped. Train tracks of grief. I live in a small town in Kentucky, near an old railway that is no longer used. It's a forgotten line, full of rusty tracks and growing bush everywhere. Since I moved here, about 3 years ago, the railroad has always been just a detail in the neighborhood, a place that no one really paid attention to. The neighborhood children avoided playing around, but for fear of snake or rusty nail than for anything mysterious. But a few weeks ago, I discovered things that had never happened before. First, it was just a strange sound at night, something that seemed distant, almost like a muffled cry. I thought it could be some animal like a cat or a coyote, and I didn't give much. But the sound continued, and each night seemed clearer, as if it was coming closer. On the third night, cannot ignore it. I was in the room with everything quiet and heard again. It was higher this time, and I could swear that it came from the direction of the tracks. I took a flashlight and decided to take a look. I know it seems crazy to go out alone at night, but a curiosity spoke louder. I walked to the end of my yard, which is about 50 meters from the railway, and I started feeling a strange cold. It wasn't the weather, it was a hot summer night, but something in the air, as if the temperature dropped a few degrees just there. Getting closer to the tracks, the sound of crying became sharper. It did not seem like an animal, but something human, almost desperate. The kind of sound that makes you a lump in your throat, even without knowing why. I was standing there, trying to understand what I was hearing, when I noticed something strange on the tracks. The light from the lantern reflected in the rusty lines, but at one point the light seemed to disappear completely, as if something was blocking it. I stared, and for a second, I was sure that I saw a shadow moving between the tracks. But it wasn't a normal shadow. It looked dense, darker than the surrounding night, and had an undefined shape, as if it were floating. I tried to convince myself that it was just my head playing tricks, but when I took another step towards the tracks, the sound of crying changed. It became louder, more acute, as if begging for attention. I came back to leave, but something made me look back. It was when I saw clearly the silhouette of a person, or something like that, crouching near the rails. He seemed to be looking at the ground, with his hands covering his face, as if he was crying. The lantern was shaking in my hand as I tried to focus on it. But before I could take another step, the sound of crying stopped abruptly. At the same moment, the figure held his head and looked me in the eye. Only there was no face. It was an empty darkness, without traces, without eyes, but I felt that it was looking at me. It was as if all the air had been sucked around me. Without thinking twice, I dropped the flashlight and ran back home. I walked into the house and traveled through all doors, trying to breathe and breathe. My heart felt like it was going to come out of my mouth, and I couldn't stop shaking. As much as I tried to forget what I had seen, that image of the faceless silhouette was etched in my mind. I sat on the couch, trying to convince myself that it was just fatigue or my imagination. But when I looked out the window that led to the tracks, I saw something that made my stomach freeze. The lantern I had left was still on the ground, but it was blinking, as if someone had planned to touch it. Only that I knew there was no one there. At least, no one alive. That night, I could hardly sleep. Every sound seemed amplified, and every time I closed my eyes, I heard that distant cry again. In the morning, I went to the oldest neighbor in the neighborhood, Mr. Harris, to try to understand if he had ever heard anything like that. He was silent for a moment, looking at me with an expression that mixed fear and sadness. Then he said, "You saw too, right? It's not the first." He said that decades ago, during the construction of the railway, many workers died in extreme conditions. Land discoveries, ill-calculated explosions, and even diseases that spread rapidly through the camps. With no resources or time to deal with the bodies, they simply dug holes near the tracks and buried them there, without ceremony, without names. "They say some never left," he muttered before sending me away with a look that said I should ask no more. A conversation with Mr. Harris was hammering in my head. If what he said was true, that explained a lot, but also made everything even more scary. That night, the cry came back, only this time it was even closer. I tried to ignore it, but it seemed impossible. I closed all the windows and turned on the TV to high volume, but still, the sound seemed to echo inside the house. It was then that he noticed something else. A strange smell, like wet earth and iron, began to invade the environment. It was not something that came from outside, seemed to arise inside my house. I went to the corridor leading to the kitchen, and the smell became stronger. When I looked down, I saw something that made me freeze. There were footprints, but they were not common. They were small, like someone barefoot, and got wet, leaving a trail of mud to the back door. I took a knife from the drawer. It was the only object that made me feel at least safe, and went to the door. The smell was so strong that it felt like I was outside, near the tracks again. When he opened the door, everything was dark, and the silence was complete, almost oppressive. I took 2 steps out and lit the backyard with the light of the phone. It was then that I saw, Right on the edge of my fence, in the direction of the tracks, was the same figure that I had seen before. She did not move, but this time she was not crouched. She was standing, totally immobile, as if she was watching me. The lantern that I had dropped the night before was at her feet, blinking faintly. My instincts told me to run back inside, but it was as if something held me there. I could not take my eyes off that figure. The lantern blinked irregularly, illuminating for a few seconds the outline of that silhouette, which now seemed clearer. I felt that at any moment she could move, but did nothing. She was just there, motionless, as if she expected something from me. My corrected mind trying to understand what was happening, but all I felt was a fear that paralyzed me. Suddenly the crying started again. This time it seemed to come from all sides, but still came that direction. It was as if it were not just one voice, but several, all overlapping in a lament that seemed to carry pain and despair. Finally, I managed to move and run inside, locking the door with all my strength. He was on the wall, trying to catch his breath, but the crying continued. I could hear him clearly, even with all the doors and windows closed. Suddenly, it began to mix with another sound, heavy steps, as if something was moving around the house, dragging its feet on the ground. Fear took hold of me. I took my cell phone and called the police, but as I explained what was happening, the sound stopped. Everything was in absolute silence. When I looked out the window again, there was nothing left. The figure had disappeared, and the lantern too. There I sat on the floor, waiting for the police to arrive, but when they finally arrived, they found nothing. I explained what I had seen, but the skeptical police officers, although they tried to be polite. I did a brief search around the house, but there were no signs of footprints, nor the lantern that I had seen before. One of them even commented that it was probably an animal or my imagination. I knew it wasn't. Those footprints on the floor inside the house, the crying, that figure, all that was real. They left, saying that they would come back if something else happened, but I knew I was alone with it. At that moment, I began to wonder if it would stop or if I had drawn the attention of something that would never leave me alone again. After that night, things became more intense. I avoided getting close to the tracks and kept all the windows and doors closed, but still heard the crying almost every night. It was as if it were chasing me, waiting for me to go back there. One day, trying to find some explanation, I decided to research more about the railroad. I spent hours in the local library, researching old archives. It was there that I found a news story dated 1892. She spoke of a terrible accident during the construction of the tracks. An ill-calculated explosion had killed workers' reserves, and for lack of resources, the bodies were buried right there near the line. The scariest part was that the article mentioned reports from other workers who said they heard cries coming from the site at night, as if the dead were still there. It moved me in a way that I can't describe. I was sure what was happening to me was connected to it. I decided to go back to Mr. Harris's house to tell him what I had found out, but before I could say anything, he cut me off. "I warned you this will follow you, boy. These tracks shouldn't be there. The dead aren't left alone." He then suggested something that at first I found absurd: go back to the tracks and leave something like an offering, a gesture of respect. According to him, some local families had done this in the past, and the children had stopped for a while. I didn't know if I believed, but at that time I was willing to try anything. That same night, I took a lantern, some coarse salt and flowers, as Mr. Harris had suggested. It seemed absurd, but I was desperate to get it over. The sound of crying was louder than ever, as if calling me. I walked slowly to the tracks, feeling the same intense cold as before. With each step, my breath became heavier, and I felt as if someone was behind me watching me. When I got to the point where I had seen the figure for the first time, I knelt down and left the flowers on the floor. I did what Mr. Smith said. Harris said. I murmured an apology, saying that I didn't want to disrespect anyone, that I just wanted peace. As I did this, I felt the air around me become even heavier, as if the whole place was instructed to me. Then I heard the footsteps again, but this time they were not at a distance. They were around me, as if something was surrounding me. I looked around with the flashlight, but saw nothing. The cry that was once distant now seemed to be by my side, low, almost like a whisper in my ears. My hands were shaking, and I could only think of finishing it and getting out of there. I threw the salt on the ground around the flowers, like Mr. Harris had recommended, and I muttered again, "I'm sorry." The moment I finished speaking, I stopped. Not just crying, everything. The silence was so deep that it made me wonder if I was still there. Don't wait a second. I got up and ran back home, never looking back. When I got home, locking the door behind me, I felt like I had run a marathon. My heart was still racing, but the silence outside continued. For the first time in weeks, there was no crying, no strange sound coming from the direction of the tracks. I sat in the room for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. Despite the silence, I still felt as if something was watching me, but now it was different. It didn't seem threatening, but as a distant presence, as if he was waiting for something. In the following days, everything was calm. The children did not return, nor the smell, and I avoided to pass near the tracks. However, something still bothered me. It was the feeling that I was witnessing something much greater than I could understand. I went back to Mr. Harris to tell him what I had done. He just agrees, as if he was already commenting. Before I left, he said, they just wanted to be remembered. Now maybe they rest. Don't know if it was really so, but even today, whenever I hear the sound of a train in the distance, I think about that figure on the tracks. I haven't been back there since, and I hope I never have to. Whatever happened, it seems like it's finally behind us. The hidden monument. I live in Charleston, South Carolina, in a house I bought about 5 years ago. It is an old house, built in the early 1900s, but I always loved its historical style. The atmosphere is quiet, with tree-lined streets and those houses with big balconies that you see on postcards. I never thought much about the land itself, except when I need to do some renovations in the yard to avoid flooding after a heavy rain. It was one of these reforms a few weeks ago that everything started. I hired a casual to dig an area where I wanted to put a small garden, but on the second day of work he appeared at my door with a strange expression. "You need to see this," he said in a low voice. At first, I managed to have some tree root or something boring that could disrupt the project. When I went there, I saw that he had dug something up. It was a stone, but different from any normal stone. It was smooth, rectangular, with well-defined edges, as if it had been worked. Part of it was covered with dirt, but you could see that there was something engraved on it. A name, T.J. McAllister, 1863, was written in clear letters but spent by time. At the time, I didn't think it was anything supernatural, but the idea of finding a tombstone in my backyard made me shiver. We decided that we needed to dig deeper around to understand what it was. The look seemed reluctant but attractive. As we cleared the land, we realized that the stone was much larger than it seemed at first sight. And the strangest, it seemed that there were more things buried nearby. We continued digging around the stone, and it soon became clear that it was not just a tombstone. It seemed to be the tip of something larger. The acquaintances began to get uncomfortable, saying that this was beyond what he had signed up to do, but I insisted. I took a shovel and continued the work on my own. After a few minutes, I saw another stone below, smaller, but also with inscriptions. This time it was not a full name, only initial, WL, and below the same year, 1863. It was impossible not to link that to the Civil War, since Charleston was an important point during the conflict. The feeling of being touching something so old and possibly historical was surreal. But at the same time, there was something unsettling. It wasn't just the idea of finding remains in my yard, it was the environment. The air seemed heavier, as if something was watching each movement. As the hole was larger, I noticed that the soil around the stones was different. It was darker, almost black, and had a strange smell, like wet earth mixed with iron. I kept digging until I found something that made me stop. It was not another stone or gravestone. It was a piece of cloth, old, torn, but clearly from some kind of uniform. My hands trembled as I pulled it from the ground, and even before cleaning it completely, I could see the details. Metal buttons and a frayed edge that looked like a military jacket. I kept looking at it, trying to understand what I had just found. It didn't seem real. It was as if the past was rising to the surface, going to be noticed. With the fabric in my hands, I started to think about whether I should continue. The idea of finding something related to the Civil War was exciting, but also scary. What if there were human remains there? I decided to call my neighbor, Mr. Carter, who has always been a local history enthusiast. He appeared in a few minutes, looking more excited than scared. When I showed what I had found, he said something to me that only increased my restlessness. This neighborhood used to be a military camp area. If you find a gravestone, there's likely to be a cemetery down here. The idea of a forgotten cemetery in my backyard made my stomach turn, but I also felt pressed to continue. After all, that was not only mine, it was history. With his help, we expanded the excavation area by carefully removing the soil. After a few hours, we found more pieces of fabric, buttons, and even a rusty bayonet, completely worn by time. It was when we hit something that none of us expected. A small coffin, partially collapsed, made of dark and rotting wood. It didn't seem big enough for an adult, which only became more disturbing. Mr. Carter suggested we stop and call the local authorities to document everything. But before we did that, I noticed something strange. The air around the hole seemed colder, and a slight buzz began to fill the silence. It was low, almost imperceptible, but seemed to come straight from the ground. I looked at Mr. Carter, and from his expression, I knew he was listening too. The continuous, almost mesmerizing hum as we looked into the hole. It was as if the sound came from inside the coffin or something even deeper. The feeling that we were not alone became unbearable. Mr. Carter, who seemed excited until then, began to retreat. He babbled something about, "Let's leave it alone," and practically ran back to his house. Stood there alone, looking at what we dug up, not knowing what to do. As much as I wanted to stop, something told me that I needed to continue. Took my flashlight, knelt down beside the hole, and lit up inside the coffin, which left me completely paralyzed. There were no bones, but the imprint of a body in the rotting wood was clear. and in the middle of the coffin something glimmered, a medallion. Took the locket carefully. It was made of some heavy metal and had an inscription on the back, "Forever remembered." In front, there was an engraving of a star with a pattern that I did not recognize. The locket seemed almost intact, as if it had been protected in some way. But holding it, I felt a shiver that rose up my spine. The hum became louder, and then suddenly everything was silent. It was not a common silence. It was as if the sound had been torn out of the environment. No bird, no wind, nothing. It was at this moment that I noticed a shadow on the ground opposite to the hole. When I looked up, there was nothing that could be casting that shadow. It was as if she was standing there on her own. Somehow, I knew I was being introduced. At that moment, the only thing I could do was to drop the locket back in the coffin. As he fell, the silence broke. The wind blew again, and the neighborhood children appeared, but the cold around the hole was still there. My mind was on fire. I took my cell phone and tried to call someone, but the signal was strange, cutting all the time. I decided I couldn't be alone. I covered the hole with a makeshift tarp and ran back inside. I can't stop looking at the backyard from the window, hoping to see something move. Nothing happened in the first hours, but the feeling of being observed continued, as if something had stayed with me. Later that night, I heard a noise that made me freeze. It was a low sound, like straggled steps coming from the yard. I took a flashlight and forced myself to look out the window. There was no one there, but the hole was unmarked, as if the canvas had been pushed to the side. My breath became heavy as I lit up the place, trying to convince myself that it was just the wind. That's when I noticed something next to the hole. It was the locket. He was there, perfectly clean, with a brightness that seemed impossible for something that had been buried for so long. I was paralyzed, trying to decide whether to turn away and take it or leave it as it was. Before I could make a decision, I heard something that made my blood cold. A low, hoarse voice, like a whisper, saying, "You have found us." After hearing that voice, I didn't think twice. I ran away from the window and locked myself in the room. My heart was racing, and every little noise in the house sounded louder than normal. I spent hours sitting in bed, holding my phone in my hand, thinking about calling the police or Mr. Carter. But how would I explain what was happening? Deep down, I knew no one would believe me. What scared me most was that the locket was out of the hole, as if someone or something had put it there on purpose. I knew I had to do something, but every fiber of my body told me not to leave the house. The next morning, I cried out with courage to go back to the yard. I took a shovel and decided to bury it all back, put the locket inside the coffin and cover the hole, as if I had never moved there. When I arrived, the locket was still in the same place, but the air looked different. Heavier, loaded with an energy that I can't explain. I knelt near the hole, put the locket in the coffin, and found to cover everything with the earth that we had removed. As I did that, I felt again the cold rising up my spine, and I had a feeling that I was not alone. It was when I heard another sound. This time, it wasn't a whisper. It was like a low, deep groan coming from the ground, as if something was reacting to what I was doing. The groan seemed to come from all sides, even if he was there alone. My desire was to drop the shovel and run, but I kept filling the hole with dirt, trying to ignore that sound that seemed more a lament. When I was done, I threw some coarse salt on the site, an idea I saw in one of the forums about strangers, and stood there, looking at the ground. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. Everything was silent for a few moments, but instead of interruption, I felt a wave of tension running through my body. It was as if something was waiting for my next action. Not knowing what to do, I whispered a sorry, almost instinctively. I stood there for a few more minutes, but nothing happened. I went back inside with a strange feeling, as if it was not over yet. That night, I slept badly, waking up to every little noise. But surprisingly, the dawn was quiet. In the days that followed, the yard quiet, no signs of movement or strange noises. For a moment, I thought it all happened, but a week later, while watering the plants near the hole's location, I saw something that made me shiver. Oh, medallion. He was there, exactly where I had the flowers placed to cover the area. It didn't make sense, since I had buried everything. Took the locket carefully, and at that moment, I felt a slight ringing in my ear, like a vibration. I decided that I couldn't leave it there, and took it directly to a local antique shop, hoping someone would know what to do with it. When I showed it to the attendant, he was silent for a moment, then said, "This should not be with you." The attendant seemed uncomfortable while analyzing the locket. He avoided touching it directly, using a piece of cloth to hold it. I asked him if he knew anything about it, but he hesitated before answering. I've seen something like that before, but not exactly the same. Objects like this usually have a history, and it's not always good. He explained to me that objects found in old land, especially near battle sites or cemeteries, often carry a kind of residual energy. He used words like memory and historical weight, but the way he spoke made it clear that he was avoiding saying something else. When he insisted, he finally said, "These things don't want to be moved. It's better to return this to where it came from." My initial intention was to leave the locket with him, but hearing this, I felt that it was something only I could solve. I came home with the locket in my pocket, feeling a greater physical and mental weight with each step. I decided that I need to end it for good. I waited until nightfall to make sure no one saw what I was doing, and went to the yard. With each step towards the covered hole, I felt as if the air around me was heavier, denser. When I got to the place, I put the locket on the ground and started digging again. This time, I was faster, almost as if I was being present. When I reached the coffin, I put the medallion back inside it, pushed the earth to cover everything, and muttered an improvised prayer. Then I threw more coarse salt on the ground and put a large stone over it to mark the place and prevent it from being moved again. As soon as I was finished, the air around me became strangely light, as if something had changed. After I finished, I stood there for a few minutes, watching the ground. The silence was so deep that I could almost hear my own breath. For the first time in weeks, the air seemed normal, without that tension that had been accompanying me since it all began. Went back inside, trying to believe I had closed it for good. I spent the night, waiting to hear something strange, but nothing happened. No steps, no moans, no familiar hum. In the morning, I even ventured to look out of the window that looked out into the yard, and everything looked exactly as it should be. It was the moment I started thinking that maybe, just maybe, that was really over. In the days that followed, life returned to normal. No strange sounds, shadows, or sensations to be observed. Even the locket seemed to have disappeared completely, as if it had never existed. But something inside me changed. Whenever I walk near the place in the yard, I feel a slight shiver, a memory of what happened. I decided to plant a small garden there, not to forget, but as a sign of respect for whatever was buried in that land. Do not know if it was what I did or simply the time, but since then everything is in peace. I still think the clerk said about the medallion, about the stories that these objects carry. You may never know exactly what happened or why it happened to me, but for now, it seems like everything has come back into place. The factory burial ground. I work in a small demolition company in Detroit. We take a lot of old factory projects and abandoned buildings, especially because the city has a huge history of buildings that were left behind after the industry started to fall. This specific work happened in 2021 when we were hired to demolish what was left of an old 19th century fabric factory. The structure was completely deteriorated, with parts of the ceiling falling and walls full of cracks. It seemed like a job like any other, until we started digging around. Our goal was to clear the area so that a new commercial building could be built there, but what we found in the first few days completely changed the situation. On the morning of the second day, one of the excavator operators called me. He seemed uncomfortable, which was strange because usually these people are pretty cool with anything that appears in the ground, from old pipes to forgotten foundations. When I arrived at the site, he was standing next to a hole about 2 meters deep. Inside, you could see something whitish, partially covered with earth. From a distance, I found that there was some kind of rubble or discarded material. But when I went down to look closer, I realized that it was nothing like that. It was a bone, and by the shape, it was too big to be from an animal. I was silent for a while, trying to process it, until the operator said, "There's more of that around here." I found another piece about 5 meters away. Following the operator's tip, I went to the other point that he worries. There I saw another piece of bone coming out of the ground. It didn't take a specialist to realize that it was human. We decided we needed to stop the excavation until we understood what was happening. I called the project supervisor, and he triggered local authorities, who sent a forensic team to investigate. While we waited, more workers came to tell us that they had found pieces of old wood, as if they were decayed coffins. At that time, the mood in the corner of works was already heavy. No one wanted to admit it, but everyone was uncomfortable with the idea of having dug up a graveyard. When the forensics team arrived, it was clear that this is exactly what we were finding. The experts were carefully digging around and soon found other bones, this time whole. Skulls, ribs, leg bones, everything spread as if the place had been rumbled before decades ago. It was then that they found something even more strange: personal objects. Rusty buttons, pieces of tools, and even a coin dated 1879. One of the experts commented that it was not a formal cemetery. It looked more like a makeshift site used to bury workers directly on the factory grounds. The idea that those people had been left there, forgotten, stirred me in a way I can't explain. Even more because, while I was watching everything, I started to feel a strange presence, as if something or someone were watching us. After the forensic team started working, the ground became even more tense. With each new hole they dug, they found more human remains and objects. Not just bones, clear signs that people were buried and were workers of the old factory. They found broken tools, pieces of worn cloth, and even an old leather belt, which still had marks of wear, as if they had been used to the limit. The chief of forensics confirmed that they were probably hasty burials, without proper coffins, only holes dug in a hurry. What made me more disturbed was when I found remains that showed signs of injuries, such as fractures and marks on bones, demonstrating that many people had died violently or during work accidents. That night, I stayed late on site helping the team organize the area. The sun had already set and darkness was beginning to take over. While I was holding some tools, I heard a sound that made me freeze. It was something like a drag, coming from near the hole where he had found the first remains. I thought it might be some of the workers, but when I lit up the area with my flashlight, there was no one there. The sound continued, low but steady, as if something was moving on the ground. I couldn't move for a few seconds until the sound suddenly stopped. It was then that I felt a cold, as if the air around me had become heavier. Even without seeing anything, it was impossible to ignore the feeling that I was not alone. After what I heard, I decided it was time to go. I packed my things as fast as I could and went back to the makeshift office on the construction site. But the feeling of being observed did not abandon me. While I organized the papers of the day, I looked out the window to the excavation area. With the dim light of the lanterns that the team had left, I saw something that made me freeze. There was a shadow moving slowly between the holes, but it didn't seem to belong to anyone. There was no one else there, at least as far as I knew. My first occurrence was trying to ignore, thinking it was tiredness or light playing with my vision. But when I blinked, the shadow was still there, and this time it seemed closer. Suddenly, the lights of the bed began to flash, one by one. I stood there, paralyzed, as they completely blacked out, plunging everything into darkness. The silence that was made was so deep that I could hear my own breath. Then came the sound, low, almost like a moan or suggestion, echoing in the area of the excavation. It didn't seem to be from a person. It was something deeper, as if it came from the ground itself. I wanted to leave there, but at the same time something told me to stay, to understand what was happening. When I finally cried out for courage to take my flashlight and leave the office, I realized that the sound had stopped. Everything was quiet again, but the feeling that something was wrong was still there, stronger than ever. Leave the office with the lantern in his hands, trying to ignore the strange cold that seemed to be surrounding the whole construction site. The place was completely quiet, and even the ordinary noises of the city were gone. When I approached the excavation area, the flashlight began to fail, blinking irregularly. It was as if something was interfering with the light. Suddenly, I heard again the sound of strange steps, but this time they were closer. The lantern lit up only small pieces of land ahead, creating shadows that danced between the machines and the holes in the ground. It was when I saw something that made me lose my breath. A figure stood near the hole where the first bones were found. He had no definite face, but his silhouette looked distorted, almost like solid smoke. The figure did not move, but I could feel her presence as if she was pushing the air around me, making each breath harder. I tried to step back, but I tripped over something and fell to the ground. That's when I heard the most disturbing sound of all. You. Not one, but several, all speaking at the same time, like a growing murmur that seemed to come out of the ground. It was not possible to understand what they were saying, but there was an urgency, almost a despair in the words. The figure began to lean in my direction, and all I could do was drag me away, trying not to lose the flashlight. When I finally got far enough away, the figure disappeared, as if it had dissolved into the air. But the voices continued, lower, like an echo that seemed to follow me as I ran back to the office. When I got back to the office, I locked the door and leaned in trying to catch my breath. The voices had disappeared, but the feeling that something was still around didn't leave me. I looked at the area of the dig through the window again, but this time I saw nothing. Even so, I cannot ignore the weight in the air, because if the place itself was loaded with something old and deeply wrong, I decided it was time to go. I took my things and, as I left the office, ran straight to the car. As soon as I went in and started the engine, I noticed something in the rear view mirror, a shadow running through the ground, heading towards the excavation area. It was fast, almost impossible to keep up, but I knew that it wasn't imagination. I drove home, but the feeling of being followed didn't leave me until I walked in the door. I spent the night awake, waiting to hear something or see signs of what had followed me. But strangely, everything was silent. The next day, when I returned to the site, I found the bed isolated by police tapes. One of the workers told me that the experts had decided to suspend the whole project indefinitely. According to him, more bodies were found, but what really caught the eye was what was buried with them. Records indicating that workers buried there were dead in inhuman conditions, forced to continue even in dangerous situations. That explained a lot, but at the same time made it clear that the place carried a story of pain that seemed far from being resolved. After hearing about the records found, everything made even more sense. It was as if the souls of those workers did not rest, bearing the weight of the injustices they suffered. The bed was closed, and no more talk about resuming the project. But even then I could not take the feeling of discomfort from my head. For days, I avoided passing near the place, but curiosity overcame me. A week later, I decided to drive there at night to see if anything had changed. When I stopped the car near the fence, I felt that same intense cold before. The ground was empty, but it looked even darker in the dim moonlight. There were no voices, no figures, but the atmosphere was charged with something indescribable. That night, while I was examining the ground, I noticed a slight movement in the soil, as if something had been discovered under the earth. It was subtle, but enough for me to get out of there as soon as possible. I never came back. Since then, avoid even driving through that area. I have recently learned that the site has been officially declared a historic site, but I also heard stories from locals about how machine sounds and screams can still be heard at night. Don't know if it's just boats or something else, but what happened in that place doesn't leave my head. It seems that the weight of what was buried there continues to haunt the present. Until today, I asked if I would find something wrong by digging up that piece of history, or if, in some way, the workers wanted to be remembered. The subway resting place. I work as a civil engineer in Philadelphia, and my role is usually to oversee large projects. In 2019, I was called on for a project that seemed to me one of the most exciting of my career, a new subway line connecting older areas of the city to modern neighborhoods. It was one of those projects that promised to transform urban mobility. At the time, I did not imagine that this work would end up being a more disturbing experience in my life. The project started normally, with deep excavations in the historic center of the city. This area is known for its layers of history, but until then all we found were fragments of old bricks and remains of colonial buildings. Everything changed one afternoon in April when one of the excavator operators called me on the radio, saying he had found something strange. Runs to the site, expecting some kind of structural obstacle or an old peculiarity. But when I arrived, I saw that it was nothing like that. At the bottom of a hole, about 15 meters deep, there was something that looked like a coffin. At first, I found it was a worn piece of wood, but when I went down to check it out, it became clear that it was more than that. The wood was cracked, and inside there were remains of tissue and bones. Everyone was silent for a few seconds, until someone cuts the ice saying, "This is museum stuff, not subway stuff." I was nervous, but I knew that wasn't a joke. I asked the team to stop work immediately in this section and call the responsible for the Department of Historical Preservation of the city. While we waited, one of the workers who was digging next door found more wood fragments, and it soon became clear that that first coffin was not alone. In a matter of hours, I discovered at least 6 other coffins, all lined up in files. They were in a bad state, the wood rotting and human remains visible in some places. The smell of the surrounding land was strong, unlike anything I had ever felt before. It was a damp smell, but with something metallic, almost like rust mixed with rot. It seemed that we were thinking of something that should have been permanent. When the preservation team arrived, I quickly confirmed what I already suspected. We found an old cemetery. According to them, the area was probably used for burials in colonial times, but as centuries passed and the city grew, the place was forgotten. This made me even more upset, because it seemed that we invaded a place that no one gave the work of conformity. As they cataloged the remains, I heard one of the older workers comment that this kind of discovery never ends well. "Things like that shouldn't be moved," he said quietly, almost as if talking to himself. I laughed to disguise, but inside I felt a strange shiver, as if something had not changed. While the preservation team continued cataloging the coffins and bones, we were instructed to avoid any excavation in the area until the work was completed. For us, this requires a specific specification in the project. I tried to concentrate on other parts of the bed, but I could not get out of my head the strange feeling that place left. Every time I approached the site of the discoveries, it seemed that the air was heavier and my breathing was short, as if something had been instructed in my chest. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I realized that other workers were noticing the same. Many could avoid that part of the terrain altogether, claiming excuses like equipment problems or fatigue. Even the most experienced just uncomfortable. That night, I stayed late in the makeshift office in the corner, organizing reports on the delay. By 10 p.m., most of the team had left. While I was going through the papers, I heard a distant sound, something between a snap and a drag, coming from the direction of the hole where the coffins were. I looked out the window but saw nothing. I thought it was a confused wind in the canvas that had been laid over the area, so I tried to get back to work. But the sound continues. Now it seemed closer, as if something was being dragged down the ground. Took a flashlight and went there, my mind divided between curiosity and fear. When I lit the hole, I felt my stomach turn. The canvas had been displaced, and around the coffins, long and deep marks in the ground drew an imperfect circle. I froze for a moment, looking at the marks on the ground. They were too sharp to be made by the wind or some animal. It was as if something had been weighed around the coffins, creating that irregular circle. The lantern was shaking in my hand as I tried to find a logical explanation, but I couldn't stop thinking about the strange feeling that place gave me from the beginning. My instinct was to get out of there, but something made me take a step closer. When I lit the hole again, I saw something that made me hold my breath. One of the wooden covers, which was once completely covered with earth, was now displaced. Only a few centimeters, but enough to reveal an empty space inside the coffin. The idea that someone or something could have moved it made me scared. I recovered some steps, trying to convince myself that it was just the result of the scary soil. It was then that I heard the sound again. It was not the wind. nor the old would snap. It was something more organic, as if something was getting confused under the ground. The sound became louder, almost like a muffled groan, and I felt the ground vibrate slightly under my feet. Don't wait any longer to find out what it was. I ran back to the office, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing, and for the first time in my career I wondered if that project should continue. While I was trying to annoy myself in the office, an absolute silence took over the environment. It was the kind of silence that made the ears buzz, as if the whole world had stopped for a moment. Still, I feel like something is out there close waiting. I looked at the clock every minute, waiting for security to arrive for the night round, but it seemed like time was not passing. I decided to look out the window to try to confirm that everything was in place. When I lit up the area with the flashlight, what I saw made my heart almost stop. An elongated, almost human shadow moved slowly around the coffin hole. I was not a worker, that I was sure. The way that it moved smoothly and without sound was completely unnatural. I thought about calling someone, but I was paralyzed. The shadow seemed to be circling around the coffins as if it worked on sight. Suddenly she stopped, and although I had no eyes, I knew that she was looking directly at me. The lantern was shaking in my hand as I tried to decide what to do. And it was at that moment that I heard again that sound, the muffled groan, as if something were trying to get out of the ground. This time he was taller, closer, and seemed to echo all over the construction site. It was enough to get me out of my slumber. Took my things and ran to the car without looking back. As I drove away, I felt like something was still following me, like an invisible weight that did not let me breathe properly. The next morning, I went back to the work corner, made to understand what had happened the night before. The night security had not reported anything unusual, but this only made me more suspicious. When I got to the coffin area, everything seemed in order. The canvas had been put on, and the marks on the floor were not so visible anymore. But I knew that I had not imagined anything. I asked some colleagues if they had heard or seen anything strange, but most avoided looking at me directly, just nodding their head in negative. Even the most skeptical workers questioned. It was then that I realized that no one wanted to admit, but everyone felt that something was wrong in that place. Later that same day, the preservation team returned to continue work in the area. They decided to dig around the coffins to map the whole place, and it was then that they found something even more strange. Below the coffins, there was a layer of stones arranged in a circular pattern, as if they had been placed there intentionally. One of the team's historians commented that this was not common for colonial burials. It seemed more a kind of symbolic marking, perhaps linked to some ritual or practice specific to the time. The discovery made the group even more nervous, and some began to suggest that the site should be closed and listed as a historic site rather than proceed with construction. While they were arguing, I heard again that sound, low and almost imperceptible but unmistakable. It was as if something was trying to get our attention from the ground. As the sound became clearer, I saw that some of the staff heard it too. They stopped what they were doing and looked around, trying to identify where it came from. The historian who had commented on the stones looked at me with an expression I will never forget. It was not just fear. It was as if he knew that there was no confusion only with the story, but with something nobody there was prepared to deal with. The sound seemed to come directly from the circle of stones, increasing in intensity, as if echoing in a hidden chamber under the ground. They decided to open the circle to see what was underneath, even with the heavy atmosphere that seemed to have taken over the place. When they removed the last layer of stones, what he found left everyone in shock. There was a narrow tunnel, like an old passage, spiraling down to the underground. Nobody wanted to go down, but curiosity was stronger. One of the workers was offered to come down with a rope and a lantern, while the others held their breath. As he went down, the sound became even louder, and I swear I heard something like a hint, though there was no one speaking. A few minutes passed, and the worker gathered from downstairs. "You must see this." Even with fear, I went down. The passage led to a small chamber, where there were more human remains, but what caught my attention was an inscription on the wall. "Let those who rest here in peace." The inscription on the wall seemed to have been made in a hurry, with something refined, and was partially worn. Even so, the words were clear, and each one seemed to carry an unexplainable weight. The chamber was claustrophobic, and the smell of wet earth mixed with something stronger, almost like iron, was suffocating. The worker's lantern lit a corner of the chamber where the bones were piled up in an unordered way, as if they were touched there without any care. Near the bones there were rusted objects, including old tools, and even what appeared to be a broken crucifix. I stood there, processing what I was selling, when I felt something go by me. It was not a physical touch, but a sensation, a shiver so strong that made my eyes tear. The worker beside me is also feeling. He looked at me, pale, and said softly, "We should not be here." I agree immediately. We started to climb back up, leaving the camera as it was, but something seemed to follow us. As we went up, the sound of straggled steps began to echo in the tunnel. We did not look back. As soon as we left, I collapsed on the floor trying to catch my breath. The preservation team warned that something was wrong and started asking questions, but I couldn't answer. I could only say that no one should go back there. The chamber was sealed soon after, and the hole was covered again, but until today I wondered if that was enough to close whatever is in that place. After the hole was closed, the construction project was suspended indefinitely. The company in charge contacted the local government to determine the destination of the site, but the responses were slow and the area was abandoned. Nobody wanted to work there anymore, and the few who came back after that day saying they felt strange things. Shadows moving around their eye corners, sudden changes in temperature, and of course, that sound, the same muffled and disturbing sound we heard in the tunnel. I never went into the field myself. I always made up an excuse to avoid any inspection or meeting that forced me to get close. What bothers me most is that, even after so long, it seems that it's not over yet. A few days after all this, I woke up in the middle of the night with the feeling that there was something in my room. I didn't hear any noises, but the same camera shiver came back. When I opened my eyes, I saw a shadow in the corner of the room, an immobile figure but clearly present. I tried to turn on the light, but the lamp did not work. When I took my phone to use as a flashlight, the shadow disappeared. Since then, from time to time, I feel that I am not alone, as if something has followed me in that place. Don't know what I really am in that tunnel, but honestly, I'd rather never find out. Just hope that one day, whatever you are there can really rest in peace. From the cemetery to the foundation. I live in a small town in Virginia, known for its old clothes and full of history. A few years ago, I was hired to help renovate the landscaping of one of these shops, a construction that dates back to the early 19th century. The work was simple: clean up the surrounding terrain, add new plants, and reconfigure some stone paths to make it more accessible. The project looked peaceful, and the team was excited. The church had a peaceful air, with its colorful stained glass windows and bell tower that seemed untouched by time. But the land around, especially in the back, was very careless, with high bush and visibly sunken parts of the ground. It was when we started working in this area that everything changed. On the second day of digging, one of the workers called me with a serious expression on his face. He said that he had found something strange while removing a piece of soil near the trees. When I looked, I saw that it was a small stone almost completely buried, but with a smooth and straight surface that did not seem natural. We dug around carefully, and soon it became clear that it was not any stone. It looked like an old tombstone. There was nothing written on it, at least nothing we could read, but it was perfectly aligned with other depressions in the ground, as if there were a pattern. It gave me a shiver, but I realized that it was only part of the church's history. Maybe it was an old cemetery. Things just started getting stranger. We decided to continue digging to understand what was standard in the soil. Soon we find more stones similar to the first, all homologated in a row that is up to the densest part of the bush. Some had fragments of inscriptions that were already completely worn by time. It was then that we found what appeared to be a bone, small but definitely human. The climate in the bed changed immediately. Nobody said anything, but everyone knew what it wanted. We tried to contact the church manager, who seemed as surprised as we were. He had people who never knew of the existence of tombs in part of the land, which seemed strange considering the long history of the place. With his permission, we call a local archaeologist to evaluate the discovery. He arrived the same day and, after a few hours examining the site, confirmed that it was an undocumented cemetery. But what he said next made the whole world uncomfortable. According to him, based on the location and the bones found, it was likely that it was a slave cemetery. The simple tombstones and lack of official documentation reinforced this theory. The idea that those people had been buried without any record or respect deeply moved me and the rest of the team. It was as if we had unearthed a piece of history that everyone preferred to forget. After the confirmation that the site was an enslaved cemetery, the atmosphere changed completely. The work was suspended, and the team waited for instructions on how to proceed. The church decided to involve local historians and community representatives to ensure that everything was treated with due respect. Meanwhile, the archaeologist asked that we delimit an area to avoid further damage to the soil. But as we continued to explore, things started getting strange. It wasn't just the bones or the makeshift tombstones. There was a feeling that the place itself was trying to say something, an energy that could not be ignored. The air seemed heavier, and it was as if an invisible presence was there, watching each movement. That afternoon, while they demarcate the land, one of the workers began to feel bad. He said that he was dizzy and short of breath, even though it was a mild day and no intense physical effort. We decided he should go home, but before leaving he commented something that gave me a shiver. It seems the air here doesn't want us to move in this place. Other workers intended to avoid that part of the land, saying they felt inexplicable chills when approaching the trees. Even I, who was always skeptical, began to notice things out of the ordinary. The wind seemed to stop abruptly when we got close, and the feeling of being observed was more intense. I tried to ignore it, but knew there was something different there. The next morning, the archaeologist returned with more equipment and began to dig into an area that seemed deeper. While he worked, he stood around, watching and waiting for directions. It was then that he found something no one expected: a small metal plate buried next to the remains. It was corroded, but still it was possible to read some words recorded by hand. "Are forgotten, but not lost." It was a knot in my throat. It seemed like someone had made a desperate effort in the past to mark that place with some dignity. The archaeologist commented that it was probably someone who tried to preserve the memory of people buried there, but without the resources or permission to do something official. After finding the plate, the mood on the ground got even heavier. During the afternoon, while we were collecting some tools, we heard a strange sound coming from the excavation area. It was a low noise, almost like a murmur, but no one could identify where it came from. We thought it might be the wind, but the sound was constant, as if someone were talking under the ground. Everyone stopped what they were doing, looking at the archaeologist, waiting for him to explain. But he just shook his head, looking as confused as we are. When I finally cried out courage to approach, the sound suddenly stopped, leaving only an oppressive silence. It was at that moment that I was sure there was something in that place that I did not want to be disturbed. After that, inexplicably, I suggested we take a break. No one was feeling the desire to continue, and even the archaeologist seemed hesitant in obligation. While we were organizing the tools, one of the workers noticed something strange in the ground near the excavations. As we follow the alignment of the tombstones, we come to an area where the ground seemed more sunken, as if something heavy had been buried there long ago. We started digging slowly, not knowing exactly what to expect, and after a while we found something that was not expected: a large iron cross, rusty and embedded in the earth. It was rudimentary, as if it had been made by hand, and was bound to the ground with chains. The archaeologist was silent for a moment, observing the cross with an expression difficult to interpret. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost as if he didn't want to be heard. "This is not just a religious symbol. It seems an attempt to hold something here." The archaeologist's comment echoed in my head as we stood there, looking at that rusty cross and the chains attached to the ground. It seemed like a deliberate effort, as if someone had tried to lock something in that place. Nobody knew what to do, but everyone was uncomfortable. The archaeologist suggested that we call in historical preservation experts before removing anything, so we decided to stop the excavations for that day. It was at that moment that once again, the one who began, the same muffled murmur, but now louder, almost as if he were around us. It was impossible to ignore. Some workers left everything and left, saying they would not return to the project. I stayed more for obligations than for courage. When the ground was almost empty, I decided to take a last look at the cross area before going. As I approach, I feel the air getting colder, even under the afternoon sun. The silence around was so absolute that it seemed wrong. I looked at the ground around the cross and noticed small cracks that did not exist before. Something seemed to be moving, but it was so subtle that I only noticed because it was close. When I lowered myself to look closer, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a voice, not a murmur, but a clear and drawn word, as if it had come out of a deep place. "Stop!" I got up so fast that I almost lost my balance and ran out of there without looking back. After running away in that area, I went straight to the person responsible for the church. I explained what was going on, but not the sound or word I heard. I thought if I said that he wouldn't take it seriously. He was visibly concerned, more about the historical and cultural impact than what we were feeling. He promised to contact experts, but asked me to keep the situation quiet until there was a concrete plan. I came home that day, but I could not stop thinking about the cross, cracks, and especially the word I heard. It was not just a sound. It was as if it had been specifically directed to me, and it made me restless. During the night, I woke up with a strange feeling, as if the air in my room was different, denser. I looked around, but everything was normal. Still, I couldn't go back to sleep. When I got up to drink water, I noticed something in the mirror in the hallway. It was not a figure or shadow, but there was a kind of light fog around me, as if it were coming out of nowhere. My mind was straight to what happened in the church, and a shiver ran through the spine. As much as I tried to convince myself that it was fatigue or paranoia, I could not get rid of the feeling that something had followed me home. It was the first time I really considered leaving the project and left that behind, but I knew that somehow it was already with me. The next morning, decide to go to church to see if anyone has already taken action. I arrived early and met the archaeologist on site, but a team of workers seemed to have diminished. Many did not show up after what happened the day before. The archaeologist informed me that experts in historical preservation were on their way, but it would take a few days to organize everything. While we were talking, he reported something that made me even more uneasy. He said that he had done better research on the cross and the chains, and that they were not just buried in the ground, they were anchored to something deeper. He believed there might be another chamber below that area, but thought it best to wait for the arrival of the experts before proceeding. The rest of the day was quiet, but the weather on the ground remained heavy. While organizing some tools, I again felt that feeling of being observed. I looked around, but I saw nothing. It was only when I approached the place where the cross was that I noticed something new. Small cracks had spread even more, forming almost a pattern around the area. Also, the land around it seemed slightly sunk, as if something was moving underneath. I called the archaeologist, who looked at it with an expression that mixed curiosity and fear. He suggested that we mark the area and avoid any activity until the experts arrived. I agreed, but inside I knew I didn't want to be around when they started digging. The experts arrived 2 days later, bringing sophisticated equipment to analyze the site. I used scanners to try to understand what was below the cross and cracks. When they finished, called the archaeologist who was responsible for the church for a private conversation. I kept watching from a distance, but I could see that something was making everyone tense. Shortly after, the archaeologist moved to me with a serious expression. He explained that the scanners detected a structure below ground. It looked like a much larger chamber than the small area we dug out before. The discovery was impressive from a historical point of view, but he did not seem excited. "There's something weird about it," he said, almost as a warning, before returning to the team. That same day, we gathered carefully to reach the chamber. Everyone was cautious, and the silence on the spot was almost suffocating. As the digging progressed, the sound returned. This time it was louder and seemed to echo through the whole terrain. It was impossible to ignore, but nobody said anything. Everyone pretended not to listen. When I finally got the camera entry, the mood became even more heavy. The entrance was a simple stone arch, partially collapsed, with strange marks carved in the stone. They were not known religious symbols, but deliberately deliberate, as if they had a specific purpose. As I looked out into the entrance, I felt that shiver again, and the sound seemed to intensify, almost like a lament coming from within. After clearing the entrance to the chamber, the team of experts hesitated before entering. It was not only the instability of the structure that worried them, it was the surrounding atmosphere. One of the more experienced archaeologists, who seemed to be the leader, decided to go in first. He wore a helmet with flashlight and took a camera to document what he found. The rest of us stood outside, watching in silence. When he entered, the sound of his steps seemed to echo more than it should, as if the chamber was larger than we had imagined. A few minutes later, we heard his voice on the radio, asking for someone to bring more light. Reluctantly, another member of the team came in with a portable generator and more lanterns. I stayed outside, but a curiosity was killing me. When I finally saw the lights go on inside the chamber, I approached the entrance to try to see something. Inside, it was possible to see rows of small objects shining under the light. They were metallic but covered with dirt and rust. More than that, there were bones scattered on the ground, arranged in a way that seemed intentional, almost ritualistic. One of the archaeologists quickly left, visibly shaken, and shook his head to the leader, as if saying that it was too much to continue. Then the sound came back, a deep lament, but now accompanied by a slight tremor in the ground. I looked down and saw that the cracks had expanded again, as if the place itself was reacting to what we were doing. The ground trembling increased, and the chamber seemed to emit a low sound, almost like a groan. The archaeologists found that the quarreler was sure he would continue, but the leader insisted I needed to document what I had found. More lights were placed inside, and as we looked at the entrance, it became clear that the metal rows were something like old plates or markers. Some were engraved with symbols, but none made sense immediately. The archaeologist who had left first refused to come back, mumbling that it did not seem just history. The atmosphere was so heavy that even workers who were far from the hole stopped what they were doing, as if they could feel the weight in that place. I don't know what gave me courage, but I decided to go in and see for myself. I took a flashlight and went down slowly, following the leader. The air inside the chamber was different, colder, but not like the cold of a common dense environment. It was as if I had a weight, something that pressed my chest with every breath. As we explored, I noticed that the cracks in the soil were more evident there, and some exceptions of having small shadows were placed inside. It was hard to tell if it was my mind playing tricks or something real. That's when I heard a clear voice, as if it was next to me. "You don't belong here." I looked at the archaeologist next to me, but he seemed to have heard nothing. That was the moment I knew I needed to leave immediately. After hearing that voice, I left the camera as fast as I could, trying not to attract attention. My heart was racing, and my mind corrected, processing what had happened. Outside, the leading archaeologist was still focused, analyzing the inscriptions on the metal plates. Some of these considerations contained names, but they were written in a strange way, mixing symbols and letters. He kept insisting that it was an unprecedented historical discovery, but for me, it was all over the line. I tried to convince him that we should close the camera and wait for more support, but he hardly seemed to hear me. Then the sound came back, louder, like a chorus of voices echoing through the hole. This time, everyone heard. The sound was not only loud, it was oppressive, almost as if it were inside our head. Some workers ran out, while others just looked around in terror. The leading archaeologist tried to keep calm, but I could see that he was scared too. Suddenly, one of the lights inside the camera blinked and went out, followed by another and another, until the whole camera was plunged into darkness. The tremor in the ground returned, more intense, and the crack began to appear around the entrance. I shouted for everyone to leave from there, and that's what we did. We ran away as the sound of voices and the noise of cracks filled the air. When we finally stopped, I looked back and saw the entrance crumble, as if the place itself was driving us out. After the chamber entrance collapsed, everything was quiet again, but it was the kind of silence that brings no comfort, only restlessness. Comments all paragraphs for a few minutes, panting and in shock. The leading archaeologist, who until then seemed obsessed with discovery, was white as paper. He said something about not having more resources to continue, and that we needed to report everything to those responsible for the historical preservation of the state. The team began to slowly disperse, each dealing with what had happened in their own way. Some workers said they would not come back, while others are justified in total denial. I myself felt that I should not be there. In the following days, the church decided to close the site completely, claiming that the site was historically sensitive and submitted to further study before any work could continue. I was relieved, but at the same time I could not get rid of the feeling that it was not finished. At night at home, I started hearing strange sounds, as if someone was walking through the corridors. I woke up more than once with a feeling of heaviness in my chest, as if something was watching me. I have never had this kind of experience before, but since that day it seemed to follow me. Even now, writing this, I feel that place will never leave me alone. I just hope that by closing the chamber and leaving the ground untouched, we have finally respected whatever was there. The park's hidden grave. I live in a small town in Colorado, surrounded by mountains, and with that quiet air of the countryside that many people associate with a peaceful refuge. In 2020, after months of working from home, I started to walk regularly in a public park near my house. It was a beautiful place with well-kept trails, a small lake, and an open field perfect for relaxing. The park always seemed to have life, with families having picnics, children playing and runners passing at all times. But after a while, I started to notice something strange. There was a specific area on the lawn that never seemed to like it right. It was like a dry land rectangle, always a little out of place from the rest of the park. People avoided going there, and I also started doing the same, although I don't know why. One morning, while I was walking, I saw a maintenance team working in this area. There were signaling cones and a tape delimiting the space. I asked one of the staff what he was betting, and he answered me, somewhat uncomfortably, that he was trying to understand why the grass never grew there, even with all care. It was an old problem, and the residents of the neighborhood already commented on this with several benefits. Some said it was the ground, others joked that the place was cursed. Despite the technical explanation of the employee, something in that piece of land always made me uneasy. Maybe the perfect shape of the rectangle, or the way the wind looked stronger there. But that day I began to pay even more attention to that place. A few weeks later, I returned to the park for my usual walk and noticed that the area was still surrounded. It seemed that nothing had changed. The grass was still absent, leaving the dried soil and some small cracks to be seen, which were no longer even more pronounced. The curious thing is that, despite being a busy place, nobody seemed to pay much attention to here. That day, I decided that I would look closer. I waited until there was no one around, crossed the insulation tape, and knelt near the rectangles. The smell of the earth was strange, stronger than usual, like something old and slightly metallic. Passed my hand on the surface, and it was harder than it looked, as if there was something buried below. While I was there, I heard a sound coming from behind me, gentle steps, as if someone was approaching. When I turned around, I saw an elderly man standing a few meters away. He had a cane and wore a dull hat with a serious expression. He was pointed to the rectangle and said, "You know what's in there, don't you?" I shook my head, confused, and he continued, "That's not so bad. This place has history, a history that no one likes to remember." Before I could ask anything else, he turned and started walking away. Stood there, with that phrase echoing in my head, trying to understand what he meant. The words of the Lord did not come out of my head. A story that nobody likes to remember. What did it mean? I came home that night and decided to do some research on the park and the surrounding area. I spent hours on the internet, but did not find anything that mentioned something unusual about the place. Obviously, the park had been built in the 1960s, and before that, the area was just empty land. Even so, something doesn't make sense. That dried up land, the rectangular shape so defined, the way the wind seemed to carry a strange cold as it passed by. It was as if that wasn't natural. Deep down, I knew it wasn't just curiosity. Something in that place seemed to pull me back. The next morning, I decided to go back to the park to see if I could find him again. I waited for hours, but he didn't show up. As he walked near the isolated area, he noticed that the maintenance team had removed the tape, but no one seemed interested in approaching. I decided to look closely once more. When I knelt down to touch the ground again, I felt something hard just below the surface. It was different from the compacted earth, more firm, as if it were wood or metal. I took a twig and started digging, and that's when I noticed something that looked like a rotting wood edge. My heart popped. It was clear that this was not a common soil problem. There was something buried there, something no one had bothered to find out. I continued digging with the branch, despite the nervousness that seemed to increase every second. Gradually, the wood became more visible. It was dark, worn out, and clearly not part of the natural soil. It looked like a big board, but it was so old that it would crumble at the slightest touch. It was then that I felt something different, a strange, strong and metallic smell, like rust mixed with something sweeter and nauseating. I backed back a bit, trying to understand what was happening, but something inside me told me to keep going. I used my hands to remove more dirt, and that's when I saw the first thing that really made me freeze. A curved edge, metallic, with a weak shine. It looked like a piece of a handle or some kind of antique ornament. Before I could think of what to do, I heard one coming from below. It was subtle but clear enough for me to stop immediately. I stood still, waiting to hear something more, but everything around me was silent. At that moment, I felt an intense cold rising up my spine. It wasn't the wind. It was different, as if the air around me had changed. I stood up slowly, wiping my hands in the pants, but I could not take my eyes off that area. That's when I noticed something that wasn't there before. Small depressions in the ground around the rectangle, as if something had contained the earth from the inside out. It was impossible to say what it was, but deep down I knew that I had touched something that should have been left untouched. I quickly moved away from the scene, trying to ignore the constant shiver that ran up my spine. As I walked through the park, I looked back a few times, but everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. Inside, I knew I wasn't. I came home feeling strange, almost as if I had carried something with me in that place. My body was heavy, my head throbbing, and I could not stop thinking of the depressions in the ground, that metallic smell, and not that it could be buried there. I decided to call the park administration to report what I found, but when I explained about the wood and smell, the person on the other side simply said that they were already aware of the problem. The coldness in the response only increased my discomfort. That night, I woke up at 3 in the morning with the feeling that someone was in my room. It was not exactly a physical presence, but something I could not ignore. It was heavy, and I was sure that I was not alone. I slowly stood up and turned on the lamp, but the room was empty. Even so, the feeling is not far away. It was as if something was watching me, waiting for me to go back to bed. I spent the rest of the night awake, with the lights on, trying to ignore what seemed an absurd idea, that it was somehow connected to what I had moved in the park. Deep down, I knew I should not go back there, but a curiosity was still stronger than fear. The next morning, even reluctantly, I decided to go back to the park. I really understood what was happening, even though a part of me screamed to stay away. I arrived early, before the place started to fill with visitors. The area of dry grass remained practically the same, but the depressions not only left even deeper. There was something different in the air, a strange silence. There were no birds, no sound of leaves in the wind, something unusual for that place. I walked towards the selections and noticed that there were recent excavation marks, but they were not made by me. They looked more uniform, as if someone had continued the work at night. The strangest thing is that no one had mentioned anything about it. As I watched, I heard again the sound of footsteps behind me. When I turned around, it was the same gentleman who had appeared before. He said nothing at first, only looked at the area and then at me with a heavy and tired look. "I warned you," he said, shaking his head. I asked what he meant by that, and he sighed deeply before answering. This place was never just a park. It was a makeshift cemetery for miners, but nobody cared enough to register. Before I could answer, he continued, "But they never rest. And now you move where you can't get away." He turned and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. After you left, I stood there trying to digest what he had just said. A makeshift cemetery for miners? The idea made sense, considering the history of the region and the accidents that often happened in the mines behind. But why had no one ever talked about it? And most importantly, what exactly did I move? I looked back at the dry land rectangle and noticed that it seemed even more out of place with the rest of the park, as if time had stopped there. Even scared, something pushed me to dig once again. I took a piece of branch and began to scrape the earth slowly until I found again the edge of the wood. This time, I managed to get a bigger chip, and that's when I felt that smell again, metallic and sweet, like something rotting mixed with rust. The air seemed denser, and I began to hear a low sound, almost like a murmur. It seemed to come from within the earth, but it was impossible to say what it said. Suddenly, the branch I was holding slipped from my hands and fell into the hole, revealing something that made my heart go, a chain. It was iron, rusty, and seemed to be stuck to the wood, as if it were part of a coffin. My breath became heavy, and before I could think of doing anything, I heard the most disturbing sound yet. A dry snap, followed by something that seemed to be a muffled groan. I dropped everything and ran away, without looking back. When I finally stopped running, I was far enough away to not hear anything more, but the sound of that muffled groan still echoed in my head. I felt on a bench, trying to catch my breath and understand what had just happened. I looked at my hands and noticed that there were tremors and dirt, but the metallic smell seemed to be soaked in them. I thought about going back to the park and alert someone, but something inside me said it was better to leave it as it was. Still, fear mixed with morbid curiosity. I need to know what that was. I decided to go to a local library that afternoon and try to find something about the park or the history of the area. After hours of browsing through old files and municipal records, I finally found something that explained what the gentleman had here. The park, decades ago, was an area where miners without family or resources were buried. Many died in accidents in nearby mines, but as they were low-income workers, their bodies were placed in simple coffins and buried in shallow graves. There were no formal records, only mentions in old newspaper notes about quick burials on vacant lots. The most disturbing thing was to find out that when the park was built, the authorities completely ignored the cemetery, covering it with grass and trails. Everything started to make sense: the dry land rectangles, the currents, and even that muffled moan. I had touched something that should never have been forgotten. With this new information, I felt an even greater weight on me. It was as if, by moving in that place, I had awakened something that had been silent for a long time. I tried to ignore it, but at night, lying in bed, my mind kept returning to the images of the park. The rusty current, the metallic smell, the muffled sound. As much as I tried to distract me, the feeling that I was being watched was impossible to ignore. When I finally fell asleep, I was woken by a sound that seemed to come from inside my room. It was a low style, almost like wood being pressed, followed by that same murmur I heard in the park. Quickly I rose, my heart pounding, and turned on all the lights. There was no one there, but the sound continued, weak and distant, as if it were coming from under the ground. What happened next was even stranger. The metallic smell, that same smell that you feel in the park, began to invade the room. Don't know if it was my imagination, but at that moment I was sure that something was there with me. Took my backpack and decided to leave the house in the middle of the night, without looking back. I spent the rest of the morning inside the car, parked away from the park and my house. Something told me that it was not just paranoia, and I needed to take action to end all this. The next morning, with the sun finally shining, I decided to go back to the park, but this time with an idea in mind: seal whatever it was. Didn't know if it would make any difference, but I couldn't ignore the feeling that moving around that place was a mistake. I took a shovel, some big stones and salt, something I saw on forums about dealing with strange energies. I felt a bit ridiculous, but I need to do something to try and close that. When I arrived, the park was empty, still early. The dry land area was there, untouched, and its sight made my stomach turn. The depressions are not only deep, but something is still moving underneath. I started working fast, replanting the land that I had dug before and covering it all again. I took the stones and placed them in a circle around the rectangle. Finally, I threw the salt in the center as a kind of symbolic barrier. As I did that, the air around me seemed heavier, and a strange wind began to blow, but only in that area. For a moment, I'm sure I heard the same muffled groan from before, but it disappeared as fast as it started. When I finished, I looked away and observed what I had done. Didn't know if it would work, but as I walked back home, the weight I felt seemed to have diminished. Since then, I have completely avoided that park, and until today, I have not returned there. I don't know if I could say what I had started, but one thing is certain: I will never forget what I felt in that place.